He has no family left. Just write unknown. I heard my son say those words from 6 feet away. I was lying in a narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles while a heart monitor clicked and beeped beside me. My mouth was dry. My hands were too weak to pull the blanket higher. Ethan stood at the nurse's station with his back toward me. The nurse looked down at her clipboard. Relationship to the patient? My son. Her pen paused. And emergency contact? Ethan's jaw tightened. He has no family left. The nurse glanced toward my bed. Ethan didn't. Just write unknown. For a moment, the machines beside me seemed louder than his voice. I could have called his name. I could have asked him why. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and swallowed the lump in my throat. I had spent 76 years on this earth. I never imagined my own son would make me feel like a stranger in my own life. Then I heard footsteps approaching. Slow, measured. The hospital room door opened. An older man stood there holding a faded army photograph between both hands. He looked at me. Stop. His eyes filled with tears. Sergeant Hargrove? My heart skipped. Nobody had called me that in decades. He stepped closer. My name is Noah Mercer. I didn't recognize him. Then he looked down at the photograph. My father spent 40 years trying to find you. Ethan turned around. The moment his eyes landed on that photograph, every trace of color disappeared from his face. Dad. It was the first word he'd spoken to me all morning. Noah slowly placed the photograph on my blanket. I looked down. 2 young soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling beneath a sky I hadn't seen in nearly 50 years. One of them was me. The other, I knew immediately. Ethan stared at the photograph for only a second before abruptly turning toward the door. Ethan, I called. He didn't stop. The door slammed behind him. Noah remained beside my bed. I touched the photograph with trembling fingers. Before we continue, subscribe and join our growing family for emotional stories of family, betrayal, justice, and unforgettable life lessons. Tell me your country in the comments. I love reading where everyone's watching from. The photograph was nearly 50 years old, and the last time I had seen the man standing beside me in it, I was being accused of leaving him to die. My name is Walter Hargrove. I'm 76 years old. Before that photograph appeared beside my hospital bed, most people knew me as a quiet railway engineer. I spent nearly 40 years inspecting bridges, repairing rail lines, and making sure other people's trains arrived safely. It wasn't glamorous work. It was honest work. And after the army, that's exactly what I wanted. A quiet house, a steady job, and time with my family. My wife, Clara, was the center of that family. She could turn a cheap dinner into something worth remembering. She kept flowers beside the kitchen window and somehow made our little house feel warmer than any place I'd ever lived. Then there was Ethan, our only child. When he was born, I held him against my chest and made a promise I never said aloud. I'd be there for everything. But promises are easy to make before life tests them. During Ethan's childhood, the army kept taking me away. One birthday, then another. A school ceremony I couldn't attend. A Christmas when I was supposed to come home but didn't. I still remember Clara telling me about that night. Ethan had sat beside the living room window in his pajamas, staring at the driveway. Mom, is Dad coming? Clara knelt beside him. He's trying, sweetheart. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. He always tries. Then he looked at her. Why does Dad always have somewhere else to be? Clara pulled him into her arms. Because your father loves you. Ethan pushed away from her. Then why isn't he here with us? Those words reached me months later. They stayed with me longer than any medal ever had. When I finally left the army, I came home determined to repair what my absences had damaged. I bought Ethan a bicycle, started taking him fishing, attended every school event I could. But something had already changed. He stopped waiting by the window. He had learned not to expect me, and I didn't understand how deeply that lesson had settled inside him. I thought my son's anger came from the years I spent away. I was wrong. He wasn't angry about where I'd been. He was angry about what he believed I'd done there. Clara's illness began quietly. At first, it was a doctor's appointment here, A new prescription there. Then came the nights when she couldn't sleep. I'd wake at 2 in the morning and find her staring at the ceiling. Need anything? I'd whisper. She'd shake her head. Just stay. So I stayed. I adjusted her pillows. Counted her tablets. Made soup she barely touched. Some mornings, I'd help her sit beside the window because she wanted to feel the sunlight on her face. I kept telling myself we had more time. We didn't. A few weeks before she died, Clara asked me to sit beside her. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Walter, I'm here. There's something I need you to promise me. I took her hand. Anything. She looked toward the hallway. There's an old locked box in the house. I frowned. What box? Just promise me you won't throw it away. I waited for an explanation. None came. So I kissed her forehead. I promise. 3 weeks later, she was gone. After the funeral, the house became unbearably quiet. Her slippers remained beside the bed. Her reading glasses sat on the kitchen table. I couldn't bring myself to move them. Ethan came over to help me sort through her things. We worked mostly in silence. He folded his mother's sweaters. I packed photographs. Neither of us spoke about how empty the house felt. Then Ethan opened the hall closet. An old metal box sat beneath a pile of coats. He pulled it out. The lock was rusted. He found a screwdriver and began forcing it open. Then I walked into the hallway. I stopped. The screwdriver slipped from his hand. Dad? I stared at the box. My face must have changed because Ethan immediately noticed. What is this? Put that away. He looked confused. Why? He opened the lid. Inside were old army photographs, medals, folded letters, and military papers I'd spent decades trying not to look at. Then Ethan lifted one photograph. A young soldier stood beside me. Who is he? I reached for the photograph. Ethan. Who? I took the box from his hands. He stared at me. I'd never seen him look at me that way before. Not angry. Suspicious. Almost afraid. What happened to him? I said nothing. Ethan waited. When I still refused to answer, he quietly stepped back. My son thought the box had finally given him the answer to why I'd been such a distant father. In truth, it had given him only half the story. Daniel Mercer was the kind of man who could make a miserable place feel almost comfortable. We met during a freezing winter deployment, when the wind cut through our uniforms and the coffee tasted like burnt rubber. Daniel took one sip, grimaced, and said, "If this is coffee, Walter, I don't want to know what they're calling breakfast." I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my cup. That was Daniel. He could make you laugh when you were exhausted, freezing, and counting the hours until sunrise. We became close quickly. He knew about Clara before I'd even shown him her photograph. I knew about his wife and his little boy. Whenever we had a few quiet minutes, we'd talk about our children. "Your boy still obsessed with trains?" Daniel asked me once. "He's 6. Everything is trains." Daniel smiled. "Give him 10 years. Then he'll become obsessed with girls." "You've got it easy," I told him. "Your boy's still too young." Daniel shook his head. "Trust me, time moves faster than you think." One night, while we were sitting watch outside the temporary camp, Daniel became unusually quiet. Then he said, "Walter?" "Yeah? If something happens to me..." I turned toward him. "Don't. I'm serious." He looked straight ahead. "Look after them." I swallowed. "Nothing's happening to you." He smiled faintly. "That's not what I asked." I never forgot those words. A few months later, we were sent on a mission that was supposed to last less than a day. It didn't. Something went wrong almost immediately. The radio began cutting in and out. Orders became fragments. One voice said, "Withdraw." Another transmission mentioned Daniel's position. Then silence. I remember shouting his name into the radio. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The last clear instruction I received was to pull back. I returned alone. At least, that's what everyone believed. And after that night, Daniel's name disappeared from my daily life. But he never disappeared from my memory. After his mother's funeral, Ethan kept finding reasons to return to the house. One afternoon, he came for a box of Clara's photographs. He stood in the hallway, staring at the closet where he'd found the old military box. For several seconds, he didn't move. "I'm only taking Mom's things," he whispered to himself. Even he knew that wasn't completely true. He pulled the box out. That night, Ethan carried it into his apartment and placed it on the kitchen table. He sat there for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. The first photograph showed me as a young soldier. Then came another. Then came another. And another. Ethan picked up my medals. He turned one over in his palm. For most of his life, he'd never seen me as a soldier. Now the evidence was sitting in front of him. Then he found the papers. Military reports. Old newspaper clippings. Folded letters softened by decades of handling. Several handwritten notes mentioned a name he didn't recognize. Thomas. Thomas. Ethan read them twice. Then he found a report connected to the mission. His eyes stopped on one sentence. His father's name. Daniel's name. And beneath them, he left Daniel behind. Ethan leaned closer. He read it again. Then again. He searched through the remaining papers, desperately looking for another page that would explain it. There wasn't one. Instead, the fragments seemed to tell the same story. Walter and Daniel had gone out together. Daniel disappeared. Walter returned. Not long afterward, Walter left the army. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For years, he'd wondered why his father never talked about those years. Now he thought he knew. He looked at the medals again. They no longer looked like honors. They looked like something his father had somehow kept after abandoning another man. Ethan opened an old newspaper clipping. The wording was cautious, but the implication was brutal. Daniel Mercer had not returned. Walter Hargrove had. Ethan's jaw tightened. He remembered every birthday his father had missed, every school event, every Christmas he'd waited by the window. All those years, he believed the army had taken his father away from him. Now he believed something worse. Maybe his father had chosen that life. Maybe he had left people behind whenever things became difficult. Ethan closed the box. His hands were shaking. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Walter's medals with pride. He was looking at them with disgust. And, in Ethan's mind, the conclusion was already becoming certain. His father wasn't the hero he'd once imagined. He was the man who had left Daniel behind. By the time I turned 76, my body had begun keeping a record of every year I'd spent ignoring it. My knees hurt on the stairs. My hands shook when I tried to button my shirt. Some mornings, getting out of bed felt like work. Ethan started visiting more often, but our visits had changed. He checked my medicine, paid a bill if I handed it to him, made sure I had groceries. Then he looked at his watch. One afternoon, I struggled to lift myself from the sofa. Ethan reached for my arm. "I've got it," I whispered. "I'm sorry, son." He stopped. "For what?" "For becoming a burden." His face remained still. "You should have planned for this." The words landed harder than he probably intended. I looked at him. He looked away. That was when I understood something I'd been refusing to see. My son wasn't taking care of his father anymore. He was managing a responsibility. A few weeks later, my health worsened enough that Ethan took me to the hospital. The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes. Nurses moved quickly through the corridor while machines beeped behind closed doors. At the admission desk, a nurse asked Ethan questions. Then I heard her say, "Does he have anyone we should list as family?" Ethan hesitated. I watched his reflection in the glass. He has no family left. My chest tightened. The nurse looked toward me. Ethan continued quietly. "Just write unknown." I said nothing. Then footsteps approached. An unfamiliar man entered my room holding a faded army photograph. He looked at me. His eyes filled. "Sergeant Hargrove." He swallowed. "My father spent 40 years trying to find you." Ethan turned. The color vanished from his face. He saw the photograph. Then he walked straight out. I looked at the stranger. "Who are you?" "My name is Noah Mercer." "Mercer." My fingers began trembling. Noah placed the photograph on my blanket. Daniel. Me. And another soldier standing between us. "I didn't come here to accuse you," Noah said. "Then why did you come?" He reached inside his jacket. "Because my father left something behind, and I spent 28 years trying to find the man he wanted me to give it to. He pulled out a worn envelope. When he opened it, I saw handwriting I hadn't seen since the night Daniel disappeared. Noah didn't hand me the envelope immediately. He sat beside my bed and held it carefully, as though the paper inside could still break. "My father talked about you every year on this date," he said. I stared at him. "Why?" "I used to think it was just a war story." He looked down at the envelope. I didn't understand it was a debt. My throat tightened. Noah finally opened it. "My father survived the first attack." I stopped breathing. "Survived?" He nodded. "He was badly injured. The radio had gone dead, and he couldn't contact anyone. He thought they'd left him there." I looked at Daniel's photograph. Noah continued. "Command believed his position had been lost. They ordered your unit to withdraw." My eyes closed. I remembered the cold, the static, Daniel's voice disappearing through the radio. Noah reached into his bag. One by one, he placed old documents across my blanket. Letters, photographs, army correspondence, a handwritten statement from another soldier, a small, battered piece of Daniel's personal effects. "I've spent years collecting these," Noah said. "My mother kept some, my father kept others. After he died, I found the rest." I touched one letter. "Why bring them to me?" "Because my father wanted you to have them." My voice barely came out. "He found you." Noah nodded. "He found you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Noah told me what happened next. After the radio went silent, I had been ordered to withdraw. But I didn't. I went back. Alone. I found Daniel alive. He was trapped and badly wounded. I tried to move him. I whispered. Noah looked directly at me. "I know." The words hit me harder than I expected. "You know?" "My father told me." I stared at the ceiling. For 50 years, I'd remembered Daniel's voice. I'd remembered his blood on my uniform. I'd remembered carrying him. But there was one part of that night I had never allowed myself to speak about. Noah reached for the envelope again. "We need to talk about what happened after you found him." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because that's the part nobody wrote down correctly." My heart began pounding. If you're still with me, take a moment to like this story and subscribe. Because what Noah told me next would change not only how my son saw me, but how I remembered the darkest night of my life. Walter went back for Daniel. But one question remained. If he really tried to save him, why had the army records made him look like a coward? Noah looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he began. "After you went back for my father, you found him alive." I nodded. "He was trapped beneath the wreckage," I said. "His leg was badly injured." Noah's eyes stayed on mine. "You carried him?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Until we heard the extraction team." For the first time, my voice broke. I thought we'd made it, but we hadn't. Another attack erupted before we reached the evacuation point. The blast threw Daniel from my grip. I hit the ground hard. Someone shouted through the radio. "Fall back." I heard the order. I ignored it. I went back. Again. Under fire. I found Daniel and dragged him toward the extraction point. This time, we made it. Daniel was evacuated, but his injuries were worse than anyone understood. He died later. Before losing consciousness, he gave me his compass. I still remember the weight of it in my hand. I said, "Our unit initials were engraved beneath the glass." He also wrote a letter that never reached me. Noah pulled it from the envelope. "My father wrote this before he died," he said. I couldn't speak. The letter explained everything. Daniel never believed I had abandoned him. He wrote that I had come back twice. He wrote that I had stayed beside him when he was certain he would die alone. He wrote that I had given him enough time to see his family one last time. I covered my face. For 50 years, I'd carried the accusation. Noah lowered his voice. The original report was incomplete. Some details couldn't be released. Witnesses were transferred before the record could be corrected. So my name stayed damaged. Yes. Noah looked at me. My father didn't spend his life remembering the man who abandoned him. He paused. He spent it remembering the man who came back. Then Noah turned toward the hospital doorway and asked one question that made me realize my son had heard more than he was ready to face. Ethan stood in the doorway. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked like a man who had just discovered that half his life had been built around a lie. His eyes moved from Noah to the photograph, then to me. "Dad." I couldn't answer. He stepped inside. I heard everything. Noah quietly moved aside. Ethan looked at the old photograph again. "I thought you were ashamed." I shook my head. I was ashamed of something. He waited. Not abandoning Daniel. I looked down at my hands. Not being able to save him. Ethan's face crumpled. Suddenly, I could see the little boy he'd once been. Waiting beside the window. Watching the driveway. Counting birthdays without his father. "I hated the army," he whispered. "I know. I thought you chose those people over us. I never chose anyone over you." He wiped his eyes. "Then why didn't you tell me?" I took a breath. "Because I thought you needed a father more than you needed my war." He stared at me. "And I called you unknown." My throat tightened. "You were angry." "No." He shook his head. "I was wrong." He sat beside my bed and took my hand. "I spent years thinking you didn't care whether I was there." "I cared every day." "Then why did you let me leave?" I looked at him. "Because sometimes a father loves his child enough to let him walk away even when it breaks him." Ethan bent forward, pressing his forehead against my hand. "I'm sorry, Dad." For the first time in years, I touched his hair like I had when he was a boy. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us finally meant something different. It wasn't rejection anymore. It was grief leaving the room. But Noah hadn't come only to tell us what happened. He had brought one final thing that belonged to my friend. Noah reached into his jacket and pulled out a small cloth pouch. He placed it gently in my palm. The weight was familiar before I even opened it. I unfolded the cloth. There it was. Daniel's compass. The glass was scratched. The metal was darkened with age. Beneath the face, our unit initials were still visible. I couldn't hold back the tears. "My father kept this all these years," Noah said. I looked at him. "Why?" He smiled sadly. "Because he said you were the reason he ever made it home." I closed my fingers around the compass. For 50 years, I had carried a different memory of that night. I remembered Daniel's blood, the gunfire, the radio going silent, the accusation that followed. But Daniel had remembered something else. He remembered that I came back. Twice. The man my son had called unknown had spent decades being remembered by another family. Not as a coward. Not as a failure. As the man who refused to leave their son behind. Noah later helped submit the old records, letters, and witness accounts through the proper military records process. He wanted my service history corrected. I appreciated what he was doing. But the truth was, I didn't care about medals anymore. I cared about the man sitting beside my hospital bed, Ethan. The next morning, he arrived carrying 2 coffees. "I didn't know which one you wanted," he said. I smiled. "Your mother always knew. I'll learn." And he did. He started coming every day. Sometimes he brought photographs. Sometimes he read beside me. Sometimes he simply sat there and listened while I told him stories about Daniel I'd never told anyone. For the first time in decades, I had what I'd wanted since Ethan was a boy. Not money. Not recognition. Not another medal. Time. Looking back, the greatest tragedy wasn't that the army misunderstood what happened that night. It was that my own son spent years judging me without knowing the whole story. Sometimes the people we think abandoned us are carrying battles they never learned how to explain. So never write someone out of your life based on half a story. If this story touched your heart, subscribe, turn on the bell icon, and share your thoughts in the comments. And if there's someone you've judged without hearing their whole story, perhaps it's not too late to listen. Until we meet again, take care of your people while you still have the chance.